Hi everyone. We'll just wait for a few more people to join. I can see people coming through the waiting room. But then we are going to kick off pretty much straight away because we've got a good detailed session to get through today. Well, we might just kick off and people can join as they're ready. So I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn session. This session's on the responsibility of local government professionals. This session was originally run as part of our Young Professionals workshop last year, but we had received such positive feedback from our members and young professionals that attended. We thought we'd open it up to everyone and run a version of it online. So I'm very pleased to introduce Matt Holt. He's from Northern Beaches Council. He's a LGA delegate of ours, but he is also a part of our LGA Committee of Management. So we're really grateful to have Matt take the time today to run this session for members. What we'll do is I'm just going to hand it straight over to Matt, but if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll get through them at the end. We'll try and just let Matt conduct the presentation and then we can go through any questions that haven't been answered then. So yeah, thanks so much again, Matt. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, and hi everyone. Thanks for spending some time in your precious lunchtime to go through this case study. Just a little bit about myself, my background. I went to UTS at Sydney in the 90s, and I was focused on local government. I was a trainee engineer out at Merriwell Shire Council doing asset management. It was my first role, and then I went into private. I wanted to try private construction, so I went into that area. Ended up working for Christie Civil in the city and Central Coast, and then I decided I wanted to be in the police. So I actually had a big career change, and I joined the police for 10 years. I was a leading senior constable acting sergeant in Surrey Hills and Leichhardt area commands in the city, and also worked in the trains central station for a little while. Then I finished up there and went back into the civil engineering industry, working in private civil construction, and then coming back into local government in 2017, where I worked at Ku-ring-gai, and then I've been working at Northern Beaches for the last long time now, actually, in various engineering roles. So I wanted to do this talk because, number one, I'm interested in training. I've done a lot of training in various areas in my life, and being a policeman, I'm kind of comfortable with coronial investigations. I was involved in coronial investigations, not of this magnitude, but smaller ones where people die, and we'll explain that later on. This is an actual civil engineering investigation, similar to like Thredbo disaster. There was another coronial investigation in that, and you can actually look that up and read it if you like. It's actually quite interesting. And this one, I just wanted to, as being an asset engineer, I wanted to create a case study on this failure of a culvert because it is a tragedy, and I don't think it's something that we should forget as in an industry. And also, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it as well moving forward. And also, that case studies are just interesting. They're engaging. You can learn a lot from them. It's a lot more interesting going through a story sort of format of a case study and learning things through that. And you can follow it along, and it's a lot more engaging than just trying to read a book. So I'll just get straight into it. There are a lot of things it's a big presentation, so there's a lot of things to unpack. So there might be things that you have a question, but it's probably likely, in my experience, because I've delivered this a few times, that it'll be answered. Okay, but in any case, we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So I'll just get straight into it. Well, let's go. And can we see that, Brooke? Is that? Yep. Okay. So essentially, just so there's context, this is actually what happened from the start. A section of the road collapsed up in Gosford, and it was the death of 5 people, 3 of them being children, in a car. So they were all in a car, and it went in there in a rainstorm, and they all died. And it happened not that long ago, 8th of June 2007, in Gosford, which is now Central Coast Council. On the New South Wales Central Coast. And it's a tragedy. It's a lot of people died, and that's one of the things and the themes of this case study is that, being an engineer, it involves doing things that could potentially, or not doing things that could potentially result in people dying, including children. So it's a serious job, and you need to take it seriously. Again, straight up, the human side of it, when we can't forget it, is that this is civil engineering. There's people's lives at stake, and these are the people that don't have a life anymore, and they died. And as you can see, there's also, just like to say, you'll see the name Adam Holt and all that. My name's Matthew Holt. I have no relation to these people. I've never heard of them before. We're doing this case study, so I'm not on a rage or anything like that. I have no relation to the people. This is a coincidence. You can see a lot of people were affected by the tragedy. Family members are still affected. It was a tragedy, and it's obviously all the people involved, including the engineers involved, were affected as well. Basically, I've done this case study from the point of view of a coronial investigation. The reason why I've done that is to kind of get the emotions and opinions out of it. I'm basically following a coronial inquiry and investigation, and essentially a lot of what's here is being considered to be fact based on this investigation. It's basically a court hearing in front of a magistrate, and the magistrate being a coroner. So who is the coroner? Because a lot of people might not really understand that. So the coroner is the thing called the Coronial Act, Coroners Act 1980, and the function of the coroner is outlined in section 22 of that act. In summary, at the inclusion of an inquest, the coroner is required to establish from evidence the fact that a person has died or people have died, that they actually did die, the identity of those people and the date and place of their death and the cause and manner of their death. So normally, well, there are big inquests when there's something that's significant for the community and the coroner decides what he investigates or not. And so in a coronial investigation, there'll be questions, and these are the questions that were asked in this investigation. What happened? Who was driving the car? Did the driver contribute to the accident? Why did the road collapse? Could and should the collapse of the road have been foreseen? That's a key question for the engineers and the council. Did the action or inaction of the Roads and Traffic Authority or Gosford City Council contribute to the collapse of the road key question as well. And is there any recommendations that the coroner wants to make? Now, the coroner can make recommendations. They're not binding, but they can make recommendations to various ministers and things. And normally they're taken seriously and in a lot of cases actioned, but they're not binding. So let's just go through the accident and the tragedy, what actually happened. So about 2:55 p.m. on the 8th of June, the family left a childcare centre and there were 5 people in the car. So they've gone and picked up the children from the childcare centre. There were 2 adults and 3 children in the car. It was raining, it was bad weather. The car was seen to fall into a chasm in the road about 3:30, and their bodies were recovered in the creek downstream the next day. The cause of death of all the persons was found to be drowning. Witnesses indicate the vehicle was travelling around 40 to 50 kilometres an hour on the road and braking was heard. The vehicle drove south and plunged into the creek, hitting the wall of the collapse on the other side before being swept downstream. Now, there's further things that happened. They didn't die instantly. There was evidence of people. The Adam Holt, who's the driver of the car, was still alive, and they were trying to save him, and they weren't able to save him. So there were people at the scene that saw it happen, and they were obviously traumatised. So just to try and place this, so this is Gosford City. I don't know if everyone knows where Gosford is. I was actually born at Gosford Hospital, so I grew up in the Gosford area, so I'm a bit interested in this. We've got the Australian Reptile Park, and we've got the M1 that comes up through here, so you're going up to Newcastle, go up to Wyong and Newcastle up there, and this is the Summersby Industrial Estate on the top of the hill. So you'll know that these are the windy bends you come down into Gosford, and then you go off this way to Terrigal, Wamberal, and the coast roads along there. So it's actually not, the location wasn't in some very out of the way place. It was actually in an industrial area, and it's quite built up area. And it's not a kind of random, not known kind of little bridge or anything like that. You can see this is the bridge here. It's actually in built up area. You can see the creek coming through here. It's a pretty deep creek, as you'll see in a minute. Yeah, and you can see it's been renamed from the people who died. It was called Piles Creek, and the bridge is called a Bragg Holt Bridge. So these are my photographs. I went up and had a look at it. So this is the new reconstructed culvert, and you can see it's just kind of like a bridge. It's an arch bridge. It's very large. It's like about 7 meters down, so it's actually it's a big structure, and it's not just a tiny little creek. You know, it can swell quite significantly in rain. There's a big catchment area. You can see the wing walls there, quite large, big wing walls here. And I'm trying to capture there how deep it is. It's actually quite deep, so you're quite high up on the road pavement area. Okay, so basically, just to get out of the way, the non-civil engineering aspects of the tragedy. So the police investigated and essentially said there was nothing wrong with the car. So they're eliminating things. It wasn't a car problem. What they established is Adam Holt was driving the car. They established that Adam Holt was driving at a prudent speed, having regard to the conditions, so he wasn't speeding. They did establish that he had been affected by alcohol and cannabis to a certain extent. But when they reviewed all the evidence, they had experts talking and etc. The coroner decided that that alcohol and cannabis consumed played no relevant part in the death. So he wasn't I think he was just over the limit with alcohol, and he had some marijuana in his system, but he wasn't completely off his head or anything like that. So then they're looking at, okay, well, here's the question: why did the road collapse? What happened? And that's what we were interested in. And what they realised was that the mechanism of collapse commenced with the abrasion and corrosion of the inverts of the corrugated steel pipes. So the bottom of the pipes, where the invert is the bottom, what has happened is water had penetrated the pipe perforations and washed soil away from under and around the pipe, causing voids around the pipe, so sinkholes. So then you had this sinkholes, ongoing loss of the fill as the sinkholes slowly rise to the surface, as more materials lost and washed away from around the pipe. And it basically reduced the stability of the pipe. And we'll go into, I'll show you photographs of the pipe and we'll talk about it in a minute. But there was a progressive loss of embankment fill material and creation of voids, which has caused the road, basically, over time, the road started to deform and drop down. And the council was aware of that, and we'll talk about that. And they just kind of filled it up at the top, but they didn't do anything about the bottom. So suddenly we have this trigger event. So the rain event was a trigger event. It had already pretty much collapsed. It just needed one big trigger event, and this is what this storm event has triggered, the full collapse. And obviously they're driving along and they couldn't see it in the rain and drove into it. So the cause of the collapse of the embankment above the culvert was the failure to adequately maintain the culvert. So here we're getting into asset engineering and responsibilities of civil engineers who are working for the government and managing roads. And that was an expert panel that was established that advised the coroner in that process of the investigation. And so basically what happened was they were using these steel pipes that came from America. Or it was an idea that came from America to use these galvanized steel pipes because they're cheap, they're lightweight, they're easy to throw in and fill up around. And there was a whole thing done in the 80s around that time. It was a bit of a, like you get a bit of a craze, a civil engineering craze where people are like, oh, this is a good idea, cheap, everyone's doing it, let's do it. So a lot of these were built around America and Australia. And what happened is that as the water is flowing along in normal conditions, pretty much, the water's going to have little silt particles or little sand particles in it. And as it's flowing along, it's banging into these corrugated inverts. And it's banging into them and knocking the galvanizing off. And that's accelerating the corrosion of the invert of the pipe. And then the water's still flowing and flowing and flowing. And then it starts pulling material from underneath and then around the sides. And then these sinkholes start forming as the water keeps flowing and sucking all the material from around the pipe down and away. And this can goes on and on and on, obviously, for a long period of time. So I'm just going to check my times. Okay. And I've taken some photographs of other failures in the US that occurred, where you can see cars going in. These are similar failures from the same type of. And here in this pipe, you can see the corrosion around the invert and the lower areas and the damage here. And obviously these pipes, they're not that strong. And so they really rely on the material taking the load and spreading the load around the pipe. And once you don't have material there, the pipe's kind of like can easily kind of crush in like that, like an egg, just boom, failure like that as well. And as you can see, that's happening. It just deforms and crushes in. It loses its structural strength. So what did Gosford Council have to say about it? Because in these coronial court matters, they get represented by barristers and they try and, argue, argue their point. Gosford Council agreed with the panel that that was why the culvert failed. So they didn't disagree with the mechanism of failure. What they wanted to bring into the story was that the initial design of the culvert included a concrete lined invert, then that would have prevented the problem of abrasion and corrosion from arising within the approximate 50-year design life. So, and we'll get to what all that means now. So, Gosford Council are saying that this should have been designed with this concrete protection layer, and it wasn't designed like that, and that was a key contributor. Now, why were they saying that? This is the reason why. Because they didn't build it. They were handed it over to them from the state government, from Transport New South Wales, or RTA at the time, have handed it over to them and said, you have to have this. And they've handed it to them and said, you're now looking after it. And this happens, okay? So basically the backstory of that is that the Pacific Highway was constructed as a deviation to allow the construction of the M1 motorway back in the day. And so when the F3 was constructed, it was now called the M1, but it used to be called the F3, was constructed, the road was transferred from the RTA to Gosford City Council, now Central Coast Council. Now that transfer occurred in 1995. So it's very important to understand that in this whole story, the Gosford Council was responsible as a road authority for that asset since 1995. Okay? No, that means you're responsible for it. Now, what Gosford Council was complaining about was they were, essentially saying we were given a dud asset to look after. The culvert was constructed around 1984. And shortly after that, the senior scientific officer of the RTA indicated that this pipe will, due to the combined effect of the water velocity through it and the nature of the sediment in the water, lose its protective galvanising coat rapidly on the upstream facing corrugations. So the senior scientific officer of the RTA at the time had recognised across the board for all RTA assets that this type of pipe was dodgy. It has a design flaw, basically. And so the RTA decided to concrete line all their culverts, except this one. And they probably didn't do this one because they thought we're going to hand it over to the Gosford Council. Maybe, I don't know. I actually don't have that information. In any case, it wasn't fixed, basically. And the investigation could not determine why, so it's speculation why that didn't happen. In any case, that asset was transferred over to Gosford Council. Now, Gosford City Council at the time, it's a large council. Now it's merged with Wyong Council. Central Coast Council is one of the biggest councils in the state. They had 165,000 residents. They're the 9th largest LGA. You can see the budget for road maintenance was $6 million at the time. The engineers are looking after a lot of assets, a lot of road length, a lot of footpaths, cycleways, drainage. There's a lot going on. That's an important thing I want to talk about later. There's a lot happening. They have a lot to do. In any case, the facts are that they obviously were aware of the asset from 1995, that they're in charge of it. But there's evidence that they were fully aware of the issue around 2002, of the issue, that there's a major issue there. The road had been subsiding, and all they were doing is repairing it with asphalt in 2002 and 2004. So just filling up from the top, not really addressing the problem. They did know what the problem was, though. They weren't unaware of the problem. They knew that. An estimate was prepared for the culvert in 2002. They got a quote in 2004. And then there was not much going on. But they did find an email from one of the engineers who described the problem, and that was in 2004. The problem is the bottom panel has rusted out. water has been getting under the apron and washing soil from around the pipes, causing the road to sink. So that's actually a snippet from the email, and that's part of the evidence. So they did know from 2004 clearly that was a huge problem, and they understood what the problem was, and that was correct, what they're suggesting there as well. And so one of the coroner's findings was that they were satisfied that the Gosford Council could have and should have foreseen the collapse of the culvert and the road above. So what he's saying is the engineers are aware of it, and they should have foreseen that was going to lead to a collapse, a serious issue. Now, the question arises, what did the coroner say about the RTA handing over that asset with a design problem? And was the RTA responsible in some way? Well, the coroner, in short, said no, the RTA is not responsible. So what Gosford Council is trying to say is, well, okay, we accept that how it failed and everything, and we don't dispute that, but we'd like to say that we're not fully responsible because RTA gave us this dud asset. What the coroner said was, no, they're not responsible. Why? I would suggest to you that that was handed over in 1995 and the collapse occurred 12 years later from the handover. It's a bit hard to say after more than a decade of you being in charge of something that it was someone else's fault that handed it over to you 12 years earlier. It's very difficult to mount that argument. That's what they tried to do. The coroner didn't buy it and essentially ruled that RTA wasn't responsible. However, they have said that, and he has made recommendations, that there's better protocols in handing over assets so that there's a more, a better process, a better template in handing over assets to another government body so that you can all agree on what's there, what the state of things are, their condition, what the risks are, and there can be some understanding around that so that risk can be managed. Now, there was a vote that was achieved in 2004 and got lost. And so they tried to get the asset manager at the time, who's in charge of that area. He fled to, well, you can say he fled, but he went on a holiday to the other side of the world when the coronial investigation was on, and are having trouble trying to summons him. And eventually they got him to come in, and his was asked why he might have forgotten about the serious situation of the culvert. So his responses were, and these are his responses, they're not made up. I lost my mother. My accountant embezzled a large quantity of money. I was in a serious car accident, and my stepfather passed away. Now, I'm not suggesting any of that's untrue, okay? But it's important. We'll come back to this later. There's a lot of excuses there, but they could be real. They could have actually happened. I'm not saying that didn't happen, all those things. But we'll talk about that and what that means for managing civil infrastructure for the public. The findings were very critical of Gosford City Council from the coroner. And I want to talk about this one. The approach of Gosford City Council appears to be similar to that of Sergeant Schultz in Hogan's Heroes, whose defence to everything was, I know nothing. So Hogan's Heroes, for those who don't know, well, and I recommend that you look it up on YouTube because there is snippets of it on YouTube. It's very funny. It was a comedy show from the US that was a historical comedy show where you had these about these US airmen that were shot down in World War II, and they're in camps in Germany by the Nazis. the whole thing about it is that the American, servicemen, the airmen, are trying to escape all the time, and they're running everything with the French resistance, and they're doing all this amazing stuff. And the German guards are just silly. They're just buffoons, and that's the whole comedy of it all. And this one of the camp sergeants is Sergeant Schultz, and he's a bumbling buffoon. And so it's quite, and this statement from the coroner was actually in the judgment after the findings. So it's actually a formal thing that they've written, and then that should speak to you. I mean, this should speak to you that the viewpoint that the coroner had about the engineers at council, it's not very good opinion. It's not a high opinion of the engineers at all. And what they've said is the Gosford City Council accepted the asset without any due diligence assessment of the asset received. It did not fully know what it received and what obligations it assumed. There was no formal inspection and maintenance regime set up to identify risks. When the road was sinking and they'd obtained an estimate and quote to repair the culvert, it didn't try to understand what the risks were. So there was no risk assessment with mitigation measures or control measures. They didn't go and get a geotechnical expert out to tell them what was wrong and what they should be doing. They lost and ignored the quotes. Their management systems didn't identify any of that. And essentially, they just forgot about it. Now, it appears there may have been a restructure in the council team at that time. And restructures cause a bit of scrambling of things. And so that's another important aspect, that if a restructure is occurring in a team, a critical team, that it's important that the information is transferred through that restructuring process. And if people leave, that the system's in place, that it's not reliant on an individual person, but it reliant on the system itself. Again, they didn't do any risk analysis. There was no monitoring, no inspections were undertaken, despite them knowing there was an issue. So this is a photograph of Sergeant Schultz. This is what he looks like. And I've taken this from, I think, a news article. The joke about Sergeant Schultz saying, "No, I know nothing," is that he actually did know what was going on, and he just pretended that he didn't know what was happening. And that was the feeling that the magistrate got. The magistrate got around that the evidence that the engineers were giving was just that they were just, I don't know what happened. And it doesn't bode well for being a professional that's in charge of people's safety, that you don't know anything all the time. So we just want to think it's a good time to look at that there are codes of ethics for engineers. So if you're a member of the Institution of Engineers, there's ethics like codes of practice, and those ethical and their standards of behaviour. Basically, ethics is essentially, it's a very complicated subject, but it's essentially standards of behaviour of what's expected. And the Engineers Australia have an ethics guide, and also Professionals Australia has an ethics guide. So if I'm a registered engineer, so I'm an RPeng through Professionals Australia, and there is an ethics code that you have to sign up to, and it's a standards of behaviour. And so, let's have a look at some of them quickly. Demonstrate integrity. If you're an engineer, you've got to act on a basis of a well-informed conscience. You're to be honest and trustworthy. You're to give respect and dignity to all persons. You've got to practice competently, maintain and develop your skills, represent your areas objectively, act on the basis of adequate knowledge, exercise leadership, promote sustainability. So there's standards of behaviour, and essentially the coroner is saying that the engineers look like bumbling buffoons, essentially on comedy show. So that's not a great opinion, and it's something to reflect on, that it's a serious business being an engineer, and there's standards of behaviour required, there's responsibilities, and if there can be moments in time, if you don't do your job, where people will die, particularly if you're you could be looking after buildings, you could be looking after playgrounds, you could be looking after all sorts of things in council, in local government, as an engineer, that could, if they're not managed properly, could collapse and you could be wharves and jetties. I'm involved in wharves and jetties. They can collapse, and people fall in the water and get killed. So we need to be careful about all that stuff as well. Basically, the coroner is saying, and this is important, it's an absolute thing. You can't have it both ways. You're either a road authority or you're not. And I think that's an important comment. You could even say you're either an engineer or you're not. If you want to be involved in managing a road, then you can't have it both ways. You either do it or you don't do it. You know what I mean? Go and do something else. If you can't do it, or you don't want to put the effort in, the competence and the effort to try and manage that, then, go and do something else. A road authority must be a competent and professional manner. Gosford Council did not conduct itself in a competent or professional manner in that instance, and serious questions as to whether the officers were adequate to carry out their functions. So if you have a manager who's having all these personal problems, I mean, there are a lot of personal problems there. Is that person at the time capable of managing the road? And does it just fall on their shoulders? And we'll talk about redundancy in engineering in a little bit. If you're a professional engineer and you don't have the skills, then you must seek external assistance. Like, I don't know everything. I'm not a structural engineer. I'm not a geotechnical engineer. I've got some idea, but I'm not super competent. So I engage geotechnical engineers and structural engineers and other engineers and other professionals, because I'm not competent in everything. And I need to know when I am out of my depth or I'm not on point with everything, and get help. And that's something that didn't happen in this case. They didn't have a risk assessment from geotechnical engineers that would say, all right, this is serious. You've got to do this now. You've got to do this. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You need to know the limitations of your own competence. And it looks like they didn't do that, and the management didn't seem to understand that either. The coroner found that there were significant structural problems in the management systems of the council and engineering management of the council. This was a finding and a recommendation that all RTA circulars and technical directions connected with the inspection, maintenance or remediation of culverts and other road assets be provided to local government on a website accessible to authorities. Now, I believe that did happen, but I'm with the huge scrambling of the RTA in the last 10 years, I'm not sure that that's still valid. That may have gone now. That the RTA make available, I mean, there is a website where you can go and you can find drawings and things to do with, transports drawings or stormwater drawings and etc. But I think you can't really, and specifications as well. But I think that's as far as it goes. I'm not sure if I'm happy if anyone wants to send me where there is current information from Transport on all their training materials for management of culverts and other road assets. I'm not sure, because they've contracted everything out now to private companies for their management and their maintenance of things. It all might be commercial in confidence. The Minister of Local Government was asked to do an independent review of Gosford City Council and look at all its records and management systems, essentially, and how it did asset management. this was sent to the Mayor of Gosford City Council and asked them to look at what they need to do in relation to their asset management and to have a good look at themselves, essentially. So what happened was I actually did contact the Minister of Local Government, and I did get that report, which is the review of Gosford City Council's asset management systems. It was carried out by this fellow, Dick Pearson, who, by the way, when Central Coast Council got sacked a couple of years ago, he actually got appointed as the administrator. So he's a bit of a, he's like a local government Mr. Fix-It guy. So his findings were that the system at the time was poor. They had no formal follow-up issues identified with inspections, no regular inspection procedures for local drainage assets, and a lack of data on drainage assets. I think he said, like, since when he did the report, they'd fixed a lot of things up. What's the takeaways from this whole situation? If you read the findings, they're not really criticising the accountants. They're not really criticising the executive management so much. There was a lot of criticism of the engineers that were running the asset management. And so I think that's something that we all need to understand, that there is an expectation that if you're asset manager and you're involved in asset engineering at that level, it's not, there is expectations that you do your job, you know, and you may be in an imperfect system that's not that's out of your control, but there's an expectation that you will act in a lot more competent and professional manner than what happened back then in this particular situation. Despite this is what I was saying. Despite the system failures, the engineers were singled out. So obviously, the Gosford Council had a lot of assets to manage. And do you think they had enough engineers to do all that management properly? Probably not. I'd like to know which council has, if you ask an engineer whether they got enough staff and they got enough money to manage the roads the way they'd like to do it. The answer nearly 100% of the time is going to be no. But that doesn't mean that you can still manage the risk, that you have capacity to manage risk. Another interesting thing to highlight is that even though the driver had a blood alcohol of 0.052 and evidence of cannabis use, it's important to recognise that the law and legal structures outside the council expect, and it's through case law as well, there's other case law that I've read as well in relation to this, some of it from North Sydney with traffic control setups, is that it is expected that the road is going to be capable of handling people who may not be perfect in their capacity. People are driving at various capacities, and the fact that someone might be mildly intoxicated is not an excuse that the road isn't in an appropriate shape. So it's important to understand that there is, and that's not an opinion, that's actually the legal position in New South Wales, that the road is not just for perfect users. Okay, so there might be people who are impaired, there might be people who are intoxicated, and there is still an expectation that the road will be up to a certain level appropriate for that level of a certain level of impairment. And obviously, to state the obvious, if you don't act in a professional and competent manner, you can be seriously criticised. Okay, so I've added this slide now just to improve on things, because we end up with discussions on, well, what should happen? So this is particularly for younger engineers, people who are less experienced. So the experienced people watching this who probably know what should happen. But let's break it down. So firstly, if you have a complex engineering system like this, you have to manage thousands of assets. There's kilometres and kilometres of things. You've only got so much resources, etc. It gets into that level of systems engineering. you need to engineer a system that's capable of managing this. Okay, clearly Gosford Council didn't have that system. It wasn't there. Now that is a responsibility of every single person who's a professional in that organisation. Obviously, the executive and the management have got more responsibility for that. But as an engineer and you're in that team, that's part of your responsibility to identify the gaps, the loops, the problems, bring it to the management attention, and advocate for a more professional system. And improvement, this concept of continual improvement, that wasn't there in this case. Responsibility has to be assigned. If you don't assign responsibility to anyone or the people, and you might have to assign in a complex system responsibility to multiple people and multiple levels of the system, there needs to be responsibility. But if you don't assign responsibility, then nothing happens. Risk isn't managed. If there's an issue, the thing isn't managed. I think you'll find that in councils, if people have been in councils for a while, people are say, oh, that's not our job, that's the other department's job. And then they go, no, that's not our job, that's their job. And while there's this back and forth going on, the thing isn't being managed because no one's taking responsibility. The third one is redundancy. You have to have redundancy in a system. If you just have an asset manager who's, lost their mother, lost their stepfather, the accountant's embezzling everyone, they're in a serious car accident, they, don't want to turn up for annual inquiry and go and run away. Yes, I will. We all have bad days. We all have bad phases in our life. I've got sciatica at the moment that's suddenly come out of nowhere. I'm out of action. It can't just rely on one person. The system has to have redundancy. In our council, for geotechnical risk things, our manager, the manager I used to work for, the maintenance manager of the roads, he had a whiteboard. Everything that was a problem went on that whiteboard. And we had weekly meetings. The little management team, we'd have weekly meetings, and nothing would come off that board. He'd have the things on there that were major risk. We also had Excel spreadsheets that are trimmed in the system that have all the problem sites, so that if someone went down and left, there's still something there being held. And then the manager above him, the executive manager, he had his own whiteboard as well with problems that were causing them concern, so that there was a kind of an oversight happening. You need to understand the risk. If you've got a problem, you need to try and understand the risk, make efforts to thoroughly understand the risk. Identify your gaps in what you don't know about the problem, and that means understanding where your uncertainty is and try and mitigate that uncertainty and your problems. So, for instance, what didn't happen there was they didn't actually get a report saying the risk is really bad here. We need to, do something immediately from a professional geotechnical engineer or pavement expert or someone who had the capacity to really understand what the risk was there. Instead of just blindly like a mouse on a wheel, just, let's throw asphalt in there, it's sinking, let's throw asphalt, we've got a quote. There didn't seem to be any urgency or understanding that this is a major risk. You need to understand the limits of your capacity as an engineer. Again, I talked about that. Use experts to build that capacity and understand the problem. Identify any immediate mitigation measures. So for those younger engineers or people new, what happens normally is you'll get a risk assessment. It's a big problem. That report normally from a geotech will say, you need to do this immediately. Okay, you need to have a 10-metre exclusion zone. You need to shut the road. You need to take one lane out. You need to do that immediately. You need to divert water away from the site. There's a lot of different measures that you may or may not do. You might have to, we need to prop it, or we need to buttress it, or we need to do something to stabilise the problem as an immediate action. Then there'll be medium-term measures which might need to be done within 3 to 6 months, and there might be longer-term measures like a renewal that needs to happen in 2 years. So you need to have a plan. Basically, it's like a quick plan. This is what needs to happen to mitigate the risk. Now, if you have it, now this is a key thing that can go really wrong in councils, and this is partly what went wrong here. And I've seen this go wrong as well. This in my career. People identify a big problem and go, okay, that's rotten, or it's about to fail. We'll put it on the renewal program for next year. Then no one does anything. Okay, so it's just on the program, and you're still allowing people to go and inhabit that structure, but nothing's been done. And you go, oh, no, we've done something. We put it on a future works program. It's going to happen next year, in a year or something. But the thing's not well at all, and it could collapse at any time. And so what's happening there is you're not holding the risk properly. If you've got risk, you need to hold on to it. You don't let it go. And that means you need to manage that up until the point it is renewed. So how you do that, you do the immediate measures. You have a monitoring program where someone's monitoring it to see if it's getting worse and worse, and up to a point where you might have to close the structure or take it out of service. But you need to hold the risk. You can't just let it go. Manage up. If you're an engineer lower down in the organisation and you're acting professionally and competently, and you see that this is a real problem and it's keeping up at night, or you just doesn't feel right, you need to escalate, and you need to keep escalating to your managers and things to make sure that it doesn't drop, that the risk is held, okay, and that you make it clear that this is not okay, basically. And because sometimes management is so busy with everything, they might not know about this problem, or they might not fully appreciate the problem, but you're there on the ground and you're seeing it and you're holding it. And so it's important that you manage up and that you declare red flag situations and say, hey, this is a red flag. This is not okay. We need to sort this out now. Okay. The next and last thing that I can think of is management review. And this is part of the redundancy, but it's also part of standards, ISO 9001, 2000, like having QA standards and management standards, that you have a review process, a management review, so that management are reviewing things and making sure that they understand where all the risks are, and they're constantly reviewing. And so you need to have that built into your way that you do things through meetings, or the way that was done. I'll give you an example, is the managers had whiteboards and they put real serious stuff on the whiteboard. And every meeting they'd say, okay, what's going on with this? What's going on with that? And they're checking in with their junior or people underneath them. And that was replicated by different levels, so that you had two managers looking after the roads, having their own problems there. Obviously, there's spreadsheets and things as well, but those managers have just highlighted and grabbed things that they see as a real problem, they think is a major risk, and they're managing it and they're reviewing it. What I got there? That's the end. So I know I can see a couple of were the victims related to the presenter? No. So they declared that at the start of the preso. Did the coroner consider the... so the answer is that I'm sure all councils would like to refuse, but under the Roads Act, the Transport New South Wales can hand over, and you don't have a say. Basically, you can have a bit of an argument about the terms and conditions, but ultimately the state government overrides local government. Some people would argue that local government is an arm of a state government. People wouldn't agree with that, but the Minister of Local Government can sack any council, so who's in charge? The state government's in charge, and unfortunately councils can stamp their feet, but if the state government decides it's handing a road over, you don't get a say. You don't ultimately, you can't say no, basically. Can I chat about non-feasance and malfeasance? Very good question. I haven't prepared for that, and they're quite distinct legal terms with definitions that I haven't prepared, so I don't really want to talk about that. However, there is the Civil Liabilities Act, that's where that lands in, and the whole history around non-feasance, misfeasance. So there's malfeasance, non-feasance, and misfeasance. Right now, I don't have that well enough in my head to talk about, but certainly, if you wanted to Google that and look it up, maybe I should build that for the future. So I'll take that on notice. So sorry about that, Gary. So I'm just reading one of the chats. Any comments on how to overcome what seems to be an ongoing issue when it comes to budgets for critical assets, addressing foreseeable problems? Seem to be developing better risk registers. Historic ways of doing this seem to still go on how things are done today. Look, we all struggle with that problem. As I said, I don't think any council in Australia and New Zealand and anywhere in the world has, and I have a friend who now works in a council in the USA, a small council. They don't have an asset management system. I'll tell you now that through IPWEA's management and the good work that IPWEA does, Australia and New Zealand have some of the best asset managements in the world. And the US, you would think that their councils are really poor with their asset management. Okay, they don't even have an asset management plan in the council that my friend's working at proper. So they don't do revals or anything like that. You'd be surprised. So we're actually pretty good. Now, how do you do it? Well, you need to have conversations and you need to act professionally. So that means a lot of the time coming up with the systems. If you don't have the systems in place, or you don't have the budgets, you have to have the conversation. And so how do you have the conversation? You need to have the data. You can't just go and start arguing with people with no information. What I've found in my career is that if you have a strong business case, if you have strong data and evidence and information to, and we're in a STEM professionals, okay? So everything's supposed to be evidence-based. But also if you're arguing for more money from a council, you need evidence. You need to develop systems where you can say, hey, we have all these problems. We have, this much money. This is what we need. This is not good enough. And these are going to be the consequences if we don't have this. If we don't do this, we don't get this money. These are going to be the consequences. And these are the conversations, and this is a lot of civil engineers in local government. This is part of the game, is that communication of fighting for civil infrastructure assets and being the professional that is going to fight for that and have those conversations. And in fact, that's what they teach in the certificate, in the professional certificate of financial management for IPWEA, which I did last year, is that it's a big component of that is that asset engineers do their asset management plans properly and have the conversation with the accountants, and that there's a two-way street going on. And a lot of the time it's a one-way street. The accountants just say, long-term financial plan, this is what you get for your renewal budget, make it work. But in actual fact, there's supposed to be a two-way communication where the asset team says, well, that's not good enough. This is what we need. And if we don't get it, these are going to be the consequences. Okay. So is that okay? Is there anything further? Just noting the time. Okay, well, no more. There's no more questions there. I hope you all took something from that. It is a tragedy and it's a story, and it's not that long ago, and it's very relevant to road engineers and people in stormwater management of assets particularly. But again, if you're building and playgrounds and all sorts of other things, it's the same. It's very similar. Just understanding this, what the consequences are of really not being on the ball, and that there is a serious job being a civil engineer for local government. It's not, you need to be professional and competent, and to be trying to meet those standards that are required by the profession. I hope everyone got something out of it. So thanks, Brooke, for that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. So yeah, well, if there's no further questions from anyone, we can close it out. The recording of this session will be put on the LGA members portal, probably by tomorrow or Monday. But so you feel free to go back and watch it. And I might, Matt, if it's okay with you, are you happy for me to share the slide pack, or is that something that we can share?
Yep, I'm happy to share it. It's one of the things is I don't want this tragedy to be forgotten by people in the profession. We need to remember it, and it's important that moving forward, that we all understand that's what the game is, and that's what can happen if everything goes wrong.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Matt, for doing this presentation again for us. Yeah, we can finish off there. So I'll close the meeting out. And if anyone has any questions further for Matt, please feel free to reach out to the LGA and we can connect you with Matt.